Today we're going to be looking at pre-made dice molds, specifically the Sophie and Toffee dice molds. They're extremely popular right now because they're cheaper than other pre-made molds and they look pretty good, but they do have some faults. So let's talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly. Before we get started, I want to talk about how this is my view of the product from my experience. Of course, you may have different experiences, and I hope that you do in some of these cases. But let's look at the build of the molds overall. The base of the molds are made out of a two-part mold. You can tell by the line on the silicone, but it's fantastic because it is this clear silicone. You can see all the way around it, make sure that you're filling it up, getting all the nooks and crannies filled, and it can also be used for UV resin, which we'll get into in a bit. It's a squish mold, so it has this top with an indented one on each of them, as most of them use the one on the surface. It's very squishy in and of itself. It's durable. It's not going to break on you. You can see this little indentation on the lid here that goes on the top. That is the squish part of the squish mold. You're essentially going to fill it up with resin and lay the squish lid on top. I like that they use the one on the squish lid for each of the dice surfaces because all in all, it's the least important number. You want the other ones to be looking pristine. One's going to be a critical fail anyway, so you're already mad about seeing that number. You can buy them in a full RPG set of 7 dice, or they can come in an individual die if you'd like to buy that as well in case you only want to make one. Now, first thing I wanted to test with these dice, since they're clear, is how well they work with UV resin to make some UV dice. So I don my safety gloves as well as my respirator, and I use my traditional UV resin hard type clearing. It will clear with just a UV lamp, which I have a little flashlight here that I'm going to shine onto the resin. If this works, I figured most other people's methods will work as well on UV resin. So I filled it up all the way to the top of the mold, and then I placed the lid gingerly on top. You will notice that I have the 10 sideways. It is supposed to go lengthwise of the dice. That's okay. All in all, it will still be a dice, and this was just a test. I shine my UV light at the dice mold for a long time. It says it only takes 2 to 4 minutes to cure for my resin, but I wasn't sure with using a mold like that if that was still going to be the case, so I shined it on there for a good 10 minutes just to be sure. After doing so, I go ahead and peel the squish lid off the top, and I was pleasantly surprised. It was already cured. Very, very well done. As far as using UV resin, you can't go wrong with the curing side of it. The dice comes out looking crystal clear, shiny. Hardly any bubbles at all. That probably has to do more with the resin itself having no bubbles being poured in. The numbers come off glossy, crystal clear. The only one that doesn't is the squish mold lid. It has kind of a matte effect on the numbers, which is different for sure. There are a few bubbles that got caught under there, but I do learn how to try and mitigate bubbles getting caught under there later. I took an X-Acto knife over the top of it just to kind of cut this ridge off, but you can see there still is a ridge here over the resin, which I heard is pretty common. You just have to sand that down to get it to go away. I do worry about sanding it on the numbers, but we'll talk about that later. For now, this is a completed UV resin dice. All in all, for UV resin, I rank these Sophie and Toffee molds pretty highly. I think it works fantastic for that, and I'll definitely be using it in the future. I'll also make sure that the squish lid lines up the proper way so that we don't have a repeat of last time. But now let's do my traditional dice making method. I take some regular resin and I mix up about 40 milliliters worth. That's enough to make a normal RPG set, and I wanted to see if it was enough to make a set here. I mix 2 parts by volume equal for Art and Glow resin, mix it up for a good 5 minutes, and this time I'm going to use 2 different alcohol inks, this blue here and this yellow. I mix the yellow in because I want to try and get a nice swirl effect. I get the yellow completely mixed into the rest of the resin so that now I have a yellow resin. I put in just maybe 1 or 2 drops of the blue here. We'll just say 1. I never went back and did another one, definitely. And swirl in the blue with the yellow. I figured this might get me a nice swirl effect, or it might come out green. Either way, it would be a fun test to do with the pour. I learned a couple of things here. First, and arguably most importantly, is I should be doing some resin pours for some oddly satisfying videos because that looks fantastic as it's being poured in there. And secondly, it takes a bit of practice to get this down. I filled up the mold properly, I think, and then I put the squish lid on top, but I noticed that there were a decent amount of bubbles and I was afraid. So I took the lid off, loaded it back up with some more, and tried to put it on a second time, which I think is the way that it should be done later. I took some videos for Twitter and Instagram because that pour was looking real good, and I filled up the rest of the molds, trying to get as few bubbles in there as possible, every now and again having to take the lid back off to remove some of the bubbles. But eventually I filled them all up. One thing that you should note about these dice molds that is a problem for me with my OCD is that the numbers do not line up. The molds do not line up with the lids properly, and that does bug me, and it may bug some people. I wish that it did, but Either way, we're going to move the molds into a pressure pot, load it up, set it to about 40 psi, and we got a problem. Every single one of the dice that came out of this mold has a huge bubble in it besides the D20. All the air had no place to escape, and it caused a problem. The pressure wasn't enough to reduce all of them, and so with no place to escape, it created these giant voids in all of the dice, and it looks really, really bad. The dice overall look okay. It wasn't yellow and blue like I planned. They just kind of all pretty much turned out green, but that void is bad. That makes for a bad dice. You can see there the matte effect is still on the dice, but the one dice that came out pretty well, the D20, still has the ridge, but looks good. I mean, as far as dice go, it is a dice. Overall, everything looks fantastic. It's just got that problem of the void. So let's see if we can solve that. Maybe the pressure pot's the issue, I thought, and so I wanted to do one sans pressure pot. I took my new silicone mixing cups and took the resin right out of there and decided let's get started again with round 2 here. I mix up the resin the same way I did before, equal volume, 40 milliliters, and now I'm going to put in some glitter because I want this one to be shiny. I was feeling very patriotic, so I went with a red, white, and blue theme. This time leaving 2 of them swirled so that one of them wasn't already mixed. So I take the red, looking like yin and yang, swirl them by mixing it up maybe 5-10 times, and calling it good. That's enough to get us a decent swirl. You can see here pouring it out. That looks really nice. It looks like Spider-Man spat in my cup, and then we decided to pour it out. I went really slow on this pour, tried to make sure that every crack and crevice was filled, and you can already see there's going to be some problems with air bubbles here. So I set the lid on top of this D6, and again, I got way too many air bubbles, so I decided to try a fix with using a toothpick to pull the air bubbles out. I thought that might help, and it did, but I wanted to kind of leave this unadulterated by not doing anything else to them except pouring them in. And you can see even bigger of a problem. With no place for the air bubbles to escape and a ton of air bubbles, none that are affected by a pressure pot, to be reduced, it's just gone. The whole dice is awful. Way too many bubbles. If you don't have a pressure pot, this is a hard sell for these dice. Maybe if you left them open face and chose not to have a number on the other side, it might be worth it. But without a pressure pot and my kind of basic experience here trying it, I did not have a good time. So I decided let's go back to using a pressure pot on these and see if we can make things better. I went online and asked people, hey, people who have these molds, how do you make them work? Because I know people love these things, so I wanted to try my own. I'm using some black and red dye on this one, and I'm going to implement some of the techniques that everybody online said were the most common solutions to their problems for the air bubbles. So now that we have our molds, let's go ahead and pour some of the resin onto the face of the squish mold. That way we can reduce the chance of there being bubbles caught in the numbers. So that was step 1, and I thought that was a good idea. Second one was to pour as slow as humanly possible. This will make sure every crack and crevice is filled and hopefully reduce some of the bubbles that are in the pour. So it took me a long time. I also tried my own technique here, which was taking a lighter and going over the resin. A lot of people do this when working with resin, and it takes a lot of the air bubbles right out of your mold, which is great, and that might help if you're doing without a pressure pot, so you feel free to try that. After you've got the resin over your squish mold, go ahead and put it back down onto the rest of the resin. I popped it in my pressure pot overnight again, and we have a better solution, but it's still not great. 2 out of the 7 molds had a problem where the other 5 were good, but the D6 and the D12 here just did not work out well. Now I can say my full thoughts after having tried this a few times. This is why most squish type molds or 2-part molds always have some sort of air vent for bubbles to escape. Even using a pressure pot, it needs somewhere for the excess bubbles to go. That's why all molds have those air ventilation sets. Even just a tiny little one works, and these Sophie and Toffee ones just don't. I think it's perfect for UV resin. It doesn't need those air vents. You can shine the light through and cure it before bubbles really become a problem. But when you're trying to pour regular resin, it's not designed that way. That's why there are those solutions of the air vents in regular dice. So, all in all, I'm not too happy with this mold. I know a lot of people are going to be very upset. They're going to say I did it wrong, and that's totally fine. You can say that I did it wrong, because I'm sure that I did. But if there is a proper way to do it, then I think a product should come with instructions on here is the exact way to get the proper results. So that was my experience with the molds. I really like the UV side of it, but I'm not going to use them for my regular resin dice making. That's my thought. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, or if you have these, how do you make them work? Maybe I can try it again sometime in the future and see better results. I know that 3/4 of this video was me failing, but I hope that it was informative for you because that's what I wanted it to be. I tried something and it failed, but hopefully you learned something out of it. With that, maybe check out my own dice making videos where I show you how to make your own dice mold and dice from scratch, or check out some of the other stuff I do on my channel and maybe share it with some other people who might want to learn how to make their own dice. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you have a fantastic day.